is for complete compliance by the Iraqis with the UN Security Council resolutions. That includes the immediate, unconditional withdrawal of their forces from Kuwait. As made clear by the President yesterday, we wanted an indication from them that they would begin that withdrawal by noon today, and we gave them 7 days in which to complete it. They refused to do that. It included as well consideration for the fact that the offer you talk about, the proposition that the Soviets and the Iraqis developed, involved a ceasefire prior to any Iraqi withdrawal. We made it clear repeatedly we were not interested in any ceasefires, that a ceasefire would simply have allowed Saddam Hussein to regroup his forces, resupply them, and could conceivably have cost even more casualties. It's also true that that proposition embodied within it the repeal of all the other UN sanctions and resolutions that have been voted by the Security Council. We felt that was totally unacceptable. We've seen just in the last 72 hours what would appear to be a deliberate effort on the part of the Iraqis to further destroy what's left of Kuwait, to put the torch to the oil fields, reports of executions of Kuwaiti citizens inside Kuwait City, and under the circumstances, the notion that Saddam Hussein should be permitted to get away scot-free without being held accountable for his actions or without having to pay reparations, for example, was unacceptable from the standpoint of the coalition. The President's statement yesterday was very clear, it was very concise in terms of what we wanted from Saddam Hussein by way of compliance with these resolutions. It was agreed upon by the coalition. It was consistent with the UN Security Council resolutions. He would have been wise to accept it. He refused to do so.
Mr. Secretary, again, can you put yourself in the position of disavowing any effort to change the government, the leadership, the political structure of Iraq by means of fully enforcing the UN resolution? Suppose you knock him out of Kuwait and he says, I'm still not going to pay reparations. Do you then go on to Baghdad to set up a government that will pay the reparations?
We've made it clear repeatedly that if Saddam Hussein were to be replaced by another government, we would not shed a tear over his demise. But we've also made it clear that it is not an objective of U.S. policy to change the government of Iraq. If that happens, so be it. With respect to the future application of the sanctions that have already been voted by the UN Security Council, how they would be applied or altered with respect to this government of Iraq or some future government of Iraq is really a matter that the UN Security Council will have to address in due course once they're driven out of Kuwait. I'll do one more question.
Any sort of communication whatsoever today from Saddam Hussein in any form?
None that I'm aware of.
Mr. Secretary.
Again, let me, by way of closing, emphasize what I mentioned at the outset, that we recognize we have an obligation to provide as much information as we possibly can to the press and to the American people. But we are currently engaged in an extremely complex military undertaking. The lives of literally thousands of Americans and Allied personnel are at stake, and we simply have to operate on the basis that we are going to, for the time being, put a lid on further briefings about the operation. As soon as it's possible to do so, General Schwarzkopf in Riyadh, General Powell here at the Pentagon, will be happy to provide as much detail as possible about the campaign itself. But that's going to have to await developments. Thank you very much.
What time did it start?
10:35, 2 hours since this land campaign began, according to the British, who, from the Prime Minister's residence in London, said that's exactly when it began, 8:30 this evening. The Secretary coming out to tell you, in terms of the military campaign, not much more than we suspect you probably know if you've been watching television or listening to the radio for the last little while. The campaign has begun, the land campaign, on a broad basis, and will continue. There'll also be some discussion, not a lot of it right at the moment, but certainly in the hours and the days ahead, about the information policy of the Pentagon. We don't have an official policy about it here. This business of suspending all briefings now is you may be interested to know, in direct contradiction to what the Pentagon told us a few days ago they were going to do. They said they were going to go on with their regular briefings. There is, as you know just as well as we do, a very considerable argument in the country now about the relationship between the press and the media. And there are Americans, both in and out of the media, who think that the Pentagon wishes to operate very much in the dark to a far greater extent than it ever has before. And we are aware, any of us who read our mail are aware, that there are a great many Americans who support that position. And we also know by reading our mail there are many Americans who think that this is not a good policy. That notwithstanding, it is part of the debate in democracy, but that is the Secretary's position for now. I can only say probably that it's going to lead to some considerable dissension between the press and the military, and again, as always, people will choose sides, some on behalf of the military, some on behalf of the press. There are pools. You may have heard the Secretary, or at least the spokesman, refer to the pools. There are 18, 20, more than 20 military pools out with armed forces in the field where reporters are out representing other reporters in small groups. We simply do not know when information will come back from actual combat units in the field, but for now, we and you are going to live with the rules that the Pentagon has set down, because whether we or you like it, that is what they have decided. So let us move on now to what we know. Not everybody, by the way, feels as strongly about this policy as the Secretary of Defense. The Kuwaiti news agency has reported within the last several minutes that the Allied forces have captured, and we can take a look at it, I think, on a map, the small island of Failaka, which the Iraqis were using to guard the entrance, really, the water entrance to Kuwait City. It's not too far off the coast. It's an island of considerable, it's not a big island, but it's not a spit and a whistle in the middle of the water either. The U.S. had been bombing it for the last several days, including using what's called daisy cutters. Some very devastating bombs. According to U.S. Military briefers over the last several days, there were Iraqi infantry and Iraqi mechanized brigades, that is to say armor on it. But according to the Kuwaiti news agency, the liberation of Jazirat, the island of Failaka, has occurred after the destruction of Iraqi tanks on the island was completed. Now, I just want to correct myself. The British said the land campaign started at 8 o'clock Eastern Time, about 2.5 hours ago, not at 8:30, as I stated. Just before we put this information argument to bed, at least just for the moment, I want to go to Dhahran in Saudi Arabia, where Sam Donaldson is standing by. Sam, to just, if you can, give folks at home, now that it's daylight there on the 38th day of the war, give people some sense at home how you're obligated to operate there in terms of getting information back to the public.
Well, Peter, you say there are pools out, and that's correct. These pools are under military supervision. They have gone where the military has permitted them to go and no place else. The military has said what units the pools can visit and what units the pools may not visit. Now, the pool reports will come back here to Dhahran at some point. How long it takes them to get here will depend on military transportation. The pool video will come back here also. It will be reviewed for security purposes. The pool reports will be looked at for the same reason, and then they will be disseminated to news organizations. And Peter, if I may, I think there's not a reporter or photographer over here who wants to release any information that would give aid and comfort to the enemy. You and I were talking earlier about where the 7th Corps was, and I said I couldn't tell you. I know where the 7th Corps is. For that matter, I'm sure the Iraqis know, but on the chance that they don't, I'm not going to give that information. On the other hand, we'd like to see other things and just what the military wants to show us. Peter?
Okay, Sam, thanks very much. Makes people hot under the collar for a variety of different reasons. We'll leave it there for now. We'll be back to talk about the military campaign, not the press campaign, in just a moment.